Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are tackling, well, a really huge topic: synthesizing the mechanics of the self.
Yeah, it's quite the undertaking.
This isn't about just, motivational talks. We want to get under the hood, understand the basic operating system of the human mind, really look at the processes that decide why we succeed, why we fail sometimes, and why actually changing feels like such an uphill battle so often.
Yeah, that's exactly right. For this deep dive, we've pulled together some really foundational frameworks from key thinkers in psychology. People like Festinger on beliefs, Beck on how we interpret things, James Clear on habits, Gottman on relationships. The idea is to give you, our listener, a kind of holistic blueprint for, well, self-awareness.
Right. And the goal isn't just recognizing behaviors, it's getting into the causes underneath. Mastery, not just observation.
Exactly.
We've kind of structured this around three big areas that all connect. First, the internal stuff, the architecture of belief, how your mind constructs reality. Second, personal action, how you actually turn an intention into something you do reliably. Habits, basically.
And third, the social field.
Hmm.
The unavoidable impact of the people and the systems all around you.
Okay, so let's set the stage. There's this core tension, isn't there? We really, really want consistency inside ourselves and between ourselves and the world.
Oh, absolutely. We desperately strive for it. We want our actions to line up with our values, our beliefs, and when they don't, the whole system kind of panics.
It creates this internal alarm.
Yeah. And that constant challenge, that potential for panic,
Yeah.
means that if you don't understand the sort of psychological rules running the show, well, you're trying to change your life, but you're doing it blindfolded.
Okay, let's take off that blindfold then. Let's dive straight into part one, the internal architecture of belief. And I think the best place to start to understand how the mind protects its own story has got to be Leon Festinger and cognitive dissonance.
Definitely. Festinger introduced this concept back in the late 1950s. And honestly, it's probably one of the most influential ideas in social psychology. The core idea is actually pretty simple. When you hold two or more conflicting cognitions, beliefs, opinions, bits of knowledge simultaneously, that inconsistency, that dissonance, creates this really quite acute psychological discomfort.
So it's not just an abstract disagreement in your head. It feels bad, like physically almost, an anxiety.
Yes, exactly. It's like a mental itch or an anxiety, something urgent that your mind feels it has to resolve. And it's a very powerful motivator.
And the interesting thing is, the brain solution isn't always the most logical one, like changing the behavior that caused the conflict. Often it changes the perception, right?
Precisely. The human mind is incredibly good at rationalization. Sometimes that rationalization is stronger than pure logic. Dissonance reduction. It lets us keep a coherent, generally positive self-image, even when there's evidence suggesting maybe we made a mistake or acted hypocritically or something like that.
So how does the mind actually do that? How does it pull off this internal spin doctoring?
Well, Festinger identified a few key strategies, especially around what he called post-decision dissonance. That's the discomfort that kicks in right after you've made a significant choice.
Like choosing between two jobs you agonized over for months.
Exactly like that. You finally pick one, and boom, you immediately feel this internal pressure to justify why that was the absolutely correct choice.
Because if you don't, the what if could be crippling. The regret.
Right, so one main way we reduce that dissonance is by emphasizing all the positives of the thing we chose while simultaneously minimizing or even just ignoring the negatives of the option we rejected.
So if I picked career A, I suddenly focus really hard on the slightly better salary and convenient location, and I tell myself the longer commute isn't that bad.
And at the same time, you start finding flaws in career B. Maybe the office seemed a bit drab or the team didn't seem as dynamic as you first thought. You rewrite the narrative to make your choice clearly superior.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I think we all recognize that feeling. But the sources also mention something called cognitive overlap. That sounds a bit more subtle. What's that about?
Yeah, cognitive overlap is interesting. It's basically finding ways to blur the lines between the two options you are considering. You look for common ground, shared positive attributes.
How would that work with the career example?
Well, maybe both career A and career B involve, say, working on projects that benefit the community. You'd focus on that shared element, the overlap. By doing that, you create a broader context. It makes the choice feel less like A versus B, a sharp trade-off where you lost something important, and more like you chose between two variations of a generally good type of path. It reduces the feeling of conflict, makes the whole decision feel more cohesive.
Okay, now I want to push on this a bit, connected to something else we've discussed. Selection bias. Isn't this dissonance reduction basically just confirmation bias? We look for stuff that proves we were right. What's unique about Festinger's idea here?
That's a really important distinction to make. Confirmation bias is more of a general tendency. We tend to favor information that aligns with what we already think. Dissonance is different because it's about the motive. Dissonance is that uncomfortable feeling, that motivational state triggered by a specific conflict. It actively drives the search for confirming information, and crucially, it also drives us to actively avoid information that could make the dissonance worse.
Okay. So the discomfort is the engine. It's the feeling of, oh, this inconsistency feels bad. I need to make it go away. That powers the selective search and avoidance.
Absolutely. Think about that classic example. The sources mentioned the new car owners.
Right. After spending all that money.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Studies found these people started reading significantly more advertisements for the exact car model they had just bought compared to ads for competing cars. They weren't shopping anymore.
They were looking for reassurance.
Precisely. Psychological validation. They needed to reinforce their belief that they'd made the right call, to quiet any lingering doubts about the cost or the features. The dissonance created by the big final purchase drove that specific information-seeking behavior.
And this need to lock down a narrative, to confirm our choices. This is exactly where the danger lies, right? Linking back to selection bias and the idea of a default story.
That's the potential trap. Once dissonance reduction helps set that default story, I made the right choice, or even, I'm just not good at X, the individual often stops looking for evidence that contradicts it.
And you get stuck.
Yes, the mind shows those signals we talked about, becoming quickly certain about the story and getting defensive if someone challenges it. If your self-story may be built to reduce dissonance around past failures is, I'm a terrible planner, you might unconsciously highlight small organizational slip-ups to confirm it and get really defensive if someone points out a complex project you actually managed brilliantly. This reinforces the flawed narrative and stops you from learning.
Okay, so that's the mind's internal architecture, desperately trying to keep its story straight, even if it means bending reality a bit. Now let's shift to the next layer. How we interpret the actual events that happen to us, the things that challenge that story. This is part B, moving from consistency to subjective interpretation.
Right, and this brings us straight to Aaron Beck and really the cornerstone of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. The fundamental insight is that an objective event itself, losing your job, having an argument, failing an exam, isn't what directly causes your feelings or subsequent action.
It's the meaning you attach to it.
Exactly. It's the subjective interpretation, the story you tell yourself about that event, that dictates your entire emotional and behavioral response.
So, okay, losing a job is the objective fact. But whether I feel completely crushed and give up or feel motivated to find something even better, that depends on the story I construct about why it happened.
Precisely. And that tendency, that habitual way of explaining events is what Martin Seligman studied extensively, particularly looking at optimism and pessimism, often starting in childhood.
Let's unpack that contrast. How does an optimistic versus a pessimistic style explain the same negative event, like, say, getting a bad grade on a test?
The pessimistic child, according to Seligman, tends to use explanations that are permanent and pervasive.
Permanent meaning
Yeah.
it's never going to change.
Right. I'm just stupid, or I'll always be bad at math. The cause is seen as fixed, enduring.
And pervasive.
Pervasive means the failure spills over into everything. Because I failed this math test, I'm probably no good at science either. Or even, I'm just not a smart person overall. The failure contaminates their whole self-concept. It feels global and devastating.
Wow, okay. And the optimistic child. How do they explain that same bad grade?
They use explanations that are temporary and specific.
Like temporary, like, this was a one-off.
Yeah, I didn't study hard enough for this particular test, or I was feeling tired that day. The cause is seen as fleeting, changeable.
And specific.
Specific means the failure is contained. This specific topic, geometry, is tricky for me. Or maybe this teacher's way of explaining doesn't quite click for me. The failure is localized to the situation. It doesn't define their overall intelligence or worth. It's seen as solvable.
It really sounds like that pessimistic style is inherently self-destructive. It takes an external event, the bad grade, and internalizes it as proof of a fundamental, unchangeable flaw in the self.
It can be incredibly damaging, and this is where the social environment becomes so critical. The research strongly suggests that a child's attributional style is heavily shaped by the kind of feedback they get from important adults parents, teachers.
So if a kid constantly hears criticism, that sounds permanent and pervasive.
Like you're always so lazy or you never seem to finish anything you start. That critical voice gets internalized. It becomes the script they use to explain their own setbacks later on. It shapes their inner narrative from the outside in.
That inner narrative. Oliver Sacks wrote so powerfully about how fundamental that continuous story is to our actual sense of identity, didn't he?
He really did. Sachs, working with patients with neurological conditions like amnesia, described her identity as being fundamentally tied to this continuous inner narrative we construct and live by. It's the thread that connects our past, present, and future into a coherent self.
And when that thread breaks, due to brain injury or memory loss,
The mind doesn't just sit there in the void. Sachs observed what he called a narrational frenzy. The mind desperately starts generating pseudo-narratives, confabulations essentially, making up stories in a frantic attempt to patch the holes, to recreate a sense of continuity in self, even if the stories aren't factually true.
wow. So even when faced with objective proof of fragmentation, the brain needs a story so badly it will invent one. That really underscores how deep this drive for a consistent narrative goes, doesn't it? Even if the consistency comes from a pessimistic explanation or a rationalization.
It's absolutely fundamental. The takeaway seems to be that your mind is constantly telling itself a story, and it works incredibly hard to make sure the current chapter feels like it follows logically from the previous ones. So if we actually want to change our trajectory, we first have to become aware of that story and maybe consciously start changing the authorship, moving away from fixed, permanent explanations towards ones that allow for growth and learning from temporary setbacks.
That's a perfect transition. If our internal architecture demands a story, and ideally a story of improvement, that story needs to be backed up by action.
So let's shift gears from the internal narrative to the practical side of things. Turning intention into actual behavior. This is part 2, the dynamics of personal action. And we should probably start with the power of tiny changes.
Yeah, this brings James Clear's work on atomic habits right into focus. And the core idea is really powerful. Significant success, lasting change. It's not usually the result of some huge, dramatic, once-in-a-lifetime transformation.
We love the idea of those transformations, though.
Yeah.
We do. But Clear argues convincingly that success is actually the product of daily habits, consistently applied. Those small, seemingly insignificant 1% improvements.
That 1% idea is key. It sounds like almost nothing day to day.
Right. But the math is startling. Improving by just 1% every day means that over a year, you end up roughly 37 times better than where you started. It's the compound effect.
And our brains are notoriously bad at intuitively grasping compounding, whether it's interest or habits. We tend to focus on the immediate linear result.
Which leads directly to Clear's crucial distinction. We should worry less about our current results, how much money is in the bank right now, what the scale says today, and focus much, much more on our current trajectory.
Okay, give us a good analogy for that. Trajectory versus results.
Okay, think about a millionaire. Great current result, right? Lots of money. But let's say this millionaire is consistently spending just a little bit more than they earn each month. Their trajectory is actually downward.
Despite the impressive bank balance today.
Exactly. Now compare that to someone who has very little money right now.
Mm.
Poor current results. But they've managed to set up a system where they consistently save a small percentage of their income each month. Their trajectory is upward.
And over time.
Over time, the person with a better trajectory is almost certain to end up in a better place. Your habits are what determine that trajectory. They're the rudder steering the ship.
Okay, that makes the focus shift feel really actionable. So if habits are the engine driving trajectory, how do we make sure we're building the right ones? How do we make positive habits obvious, almost unavoidable?
The very first step, Clear emphasizes, is just awareness. So many of our habits, especially the negative ones, run on autopilot. We don't even consciously register the cues that trigger them.
Like mindlessly grabbing your phone the second you feel bored.
Exactly. So he suggests a really simple but powerful exercise called the habit scorecard. You literally just list out your daily behaviors, waking up, brushing teeth, checking email, having coffee, scrolling social media, everything, and then you just mark each one as positive, plus, negative, or neutral in relation to your goals. It sounds basic, but doing it honestly forces you to see the patterns you weren't aware of.
I can imagine that being quite revealing, maybe even a bit uncomfortable.
It definitely can be. But that awareness is the necessary starting point. Once you can see the cues and the habits, then you can start consciously designing better ones. One really effective technique is using implementation intentions.
That sounds fancy, but what is it actually?
It's basically pre-deciding exactly when and where you're going to perform a desired habit. It
Yeah.
moves the decision from the future moment, when you might be tired or lack motivation, to the present moment of planning.
So instead of just saying, I want to meditate more,
You make it specific. I will meditate for 10 minutes at 7 a.m. in my living room armchair. That specificity, the behavior, time, and location dramatically increases the chances you'll actually follow through. It creates a clear plan for your brain.
it feels like it bypasses the need for willpower in the moment, like setting a very clear appointment with yourself.
That's a great way to put it. And another powerful technique is habit stacking.
Okay, what's that?
Habit stacking leverages habits you already have. You anchor the new desired habit to an existing one that's firmly established. The formula is simple. After I current habit, I will new habit.
So, like, after I pour my morning coffee, I will immediately sit down and write for 15 minutes.
Perfect example.
Uh-huh.
The existing habit pouring coffee becomes the automatic trigger, the cue, for the new habit you want to build. It piggybacks on an established neural pathway.
And presumably, the reverse works for breaking bad habits, making the cues less obvious.
Absolutely, that's the inversion. If you want to stop snacking late at night, make the cue invisible. Don't keep junk food easily accessible in the kitchen. If you waste too much time on your phone, make the cue unattractive or difficult. Maybe put your phone in a drawer in another room after work. Design your environment to make the bad habits harder and the good habits easier.
This emphasis on structure and environment seems crucial because as we move into the next idea, it becomes clear we can't just rely on sheer willpower, can we? Our moment-to-moment self-control is often pretty shaky.
Yeah, we really can't. Dan Ariely's work on procrastination and the power of temptation makes this painfully clear. We consistently fail to achieve our long-term goals, things like saving for retirement, finishing that big project, eating healthier.
Because the short-term reward is right there.
Exactly. In the actual moment of choice, the immediate pleasure or ease of the temptation, watching another episode, eating the cookie, putting off the difficult task, almost always wins out over the abstract, distant benefit of the long-term goal. Ariely argues that without setting up pre-commitment strategies, we're basically setting ourselves up to fail against temptation.
I remember his research on student deadlines being really telling. The external structure really helped.
Yes, that was fascinating. He found that students who had deadlines imposed on them by the professor for submitting papers actually performed better, got higher grades than students who were allowed to choose their own deadlines throughout the semester.
And both groups did way better than students who just had one single deadline at the very end.
Right. That imposed external structure, that sort of authoritative external voice, it removed the daily internal battle of should I work on this now or later. It provided discipline from the outside.
So the practical takeaway is we need to use our moments of clarity when we're motivated and thinking long-term to bind our future selves, to set up systems that make the right choice the easier choice later on.
That's the core idea of pre-commitment. You design a system for yourself, knowing your future self is likely to be tempted or procrastinate. You make the desired behavior the path of least resistance in advance.
And when we manage to create that structure and discipline our actions effectively, sometimes we hit that amazing state Csikszentmihalyi called flow.
Ah, yes, flow. It's such a sought-after state. And Csikszentmihalyi's reasoning for why it's so desirable is quite profound. He argued that achieving an ordered state of mind, like flow, is actually quite difficult.
Because the default state isn't peace.
No. He argued that the normal state of the mind, left to its own devices, is actually chaos. Mental entropy, a constant barrage of worries, distractions, conflicting desires.
That's a pretty bleak view of our baseline. So how does flow cut through that chaos?
Flow happens when your psychic energy, your attention, is fully invested in realistic goals, and crucially, when the level of challenge in the activity is perfectly matched to your level of skill.
Not too easy, not too hard.
Exactly. Too easy, you get bored. Too hard, you get anxious. Flow is that sweet spot right in between. And when you're in flow, that background mental noise, the chaos, the worries, it just vanishes. It's replaced by deep enjoyment, intense focus on the present, and a feeling of operating effortlessly.
It sounds like you have to be really engaged in the process itself to hit flow, which connects nicely to Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset, doesn't it?
It really does. Dweck found that people with a growth mindset, the belief that abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work, tend to focus on and take charge of the processes that lead to success. They don't just focus on innate talent or just trying hard randomly.
They see mistakes differently.
Yes. They see mistakes and setbacks, not as proof of their fixed limitations, but as opportunities to learn, as valuable information for improving the process. So if you're in flow, you're deeply immersed in a process. The growth mindset is the underlying belief system that validates that deep engagement, that tells you the effort and the learning involved in the process are what truly matter for development more than any single outcome.
Okay, so we've built up this picture. The internal story we tell ourselves requires consistency. Part 1, cognition. And making progress on that story requires consistent, structured action. Part 2, habits and action. Now let's bring in the final and maybe the most complex layer. Part 3, the social field of self. How our relationships and the systems we're embedded in shape everything.
Right, and a really powerful lens for looking at our closest relationships is attachment theory.
Which originally came from studying infants and caregivers, but applies to adults too.
Yes, exactly. And what makes it so valuable for understanding adult romance is that the foundational research looked at the general population, not just people already in therapy. This allowed researchers to see that a lot of behaviors that might seem dysfunctional or irrational on the surface, like constantly needing reassurance, or withdrawing emotionally, or getting fixated on an ex, are often understandable, even predictable patterns rooted in our fundamental attachment needs. They aren't necessarily signs of individual pathology.
So it sort of normalizes relationship struggles by putting them into these patterns or styles. Let's quickly outline the two main insecure styles that often cause friction: anxious and avoidant.
Good idea. So someone with an anxious attachment style typically has a high need for intimacy and connection. They often worry about their partner's love and availability, fearing abandonment.
And they might act out on those fears.
Yes, they might engage in what's called protest behavior when feeling insecure, things like excessive calling or texting, trying to make the partner jealous, withdrawing abruptly to punish them, or having big emotional swings, all aimed at trying to reestablish a feeling of connection and security.
Okay, and the avoidant style.
The avoidance style is almost the mirror image. They tend to feel uncomfortable with too much closeness, equating intimacy with a loss of independence or freedom. They prioritize self-reliance and often suppress or deactivate their attachment needs when a relationship feels too close or demanding.
And the sources suggest that when these two styles end up together, that's often where the real fireworks happen.
That's the classic anxious avoidant trap, as Levine and Heller call it in Attached. It's a very common pairing, ironically. The anxious person's pursuit can feel validating to the avoidant initially, and the avoidant's distance can feel familiar, almost comfortable, to the anxious person based on earlier experiences.
But their core needs clash.
Fundamentally, one partner consistently pushes for more closeness, reassurance, and intimacy, while the other consistently pulls away, needing space and feeling suffocated. This mismatch in intimacy needs almost inevitably leads to lower relationship satisfaction and can become the dominant, exhausting dynamic in their interactions.
When the avoidant partner feels that pressure, feels things are getting too close, they use what the sources call deactivating strategies. What are some concrete examples of those?
These are often unconscious tactics to kind of turn down the volume on their own attachment system to create distance. Examples include things like mentally focusing on their partner's small flaws, nitpicking.
To justify the need for distance.
Exactly. Or fantasizing about an idealized phantom ex, or even just a hypothetical perfect partner comparing the current partner unfavorably. They might use all or nothing thinking, this relationship isn't perfect, so it must be completely wrong. Or they might just physically or emotionally withdraw, suddenly getting really busy, becoming less communicative, seeming distant or unapproachable, sometimes even picking fights to create space.
It sounds like building shields to protect their independence.
That's a good way to put it. Unconscious shields against perceived engulfment.
Okay, if that's the dynamic around intimacy needs, let's talk about conflict itself. John Gottman's research identified some really destructive communication patterns. Which one did he single out as particularly lethal for relationships?
Defensiveness. Gottman calls it one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for relationships. Defensiveness is basically finding ways to blame your partner, to ward off a perceived attack by essentially saying, the problem isn't me, it's you.
So instead of listening to the complaint, you make excuses or you fire back with a complaint of your own.
Right. It often comes out as righteous indignation, how dare you suggest that, or cross-complaining, well, you didn't take the trash out either. It completely shuts down any possibility of resolving the actual issue because you're not taking any responsibility. It just escalates the conflict.
And defensiveness makes it impossible to do what Gottman found was actually crucial for long-term success: repair attempts.
Exactly. All couples have conflict. What distinguishes successful couples is their ability to repair the connection during or after a fight. A repair attempt can be anything as sincere, using humor to break the tension, reaching out physically.
But whether that repair attempt lands.
Depends almost entirely on the underlying quality of the relationship, what Gottman calls the marital friendship. If there's a foundation of trust, affection, and respect, even clumsy repair attempts usually work. If that foundation is weak, poisoned by contempt or defensiveness, repairs are often rejected or not even noticed.
And there's that physiological state that makes repair impossible, flooding.
Ah, yes, flooding. This is critical to understand. Flooding is when you become physiologically overwhelmed by negative emotion during conflict. Your heart rate skyrockets. Stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol flood your system. You're basically in fight or flight mode.
And you can't think straight.
You literally can't. Your ability to process information, listen empathetically, think rationally, problem solve, it all goes offline. When someone is flooded, they cannot hear or accept a partner's repair attempt, no matter how well-intentioned. Their system is just trying to survive the perceived threat.
So the only solution when flooding happens is to stop. Take a break.
Absolutely. Gottman advises couples to agree on a signal for needing a break, take at least 20 minutes apart to calm down physiologically, and then try to re-engage later when they're both calm. Continuing an argument while flooded is completely counterproductive.
So to counter that defensiveness and avoid flooding, the advice often comes back to taking ownership, right? Using I statements instead of you statements.
That's the cornerstone of healthier conflict. Shifting from blaming, "You always make me feel," to expressing your own experience. When X happens, I feel Y, and what I need is Z. It has to be specific. I notice the dishes aren't done, and I feel overwhelmed and unsupported. I need us to figure out a better system for sharing that chore. It moves from accusation to vulnerability and a request for collaboration.
And what about those really sticky problems, the ones that never seem to get resolved? Gottman calls them gridlocked problems.
Right, those perpetual issues often rooted in fundamental differences in values or personality, like one partner being a spender and the other a saver, or differing needs for neatness.
You can't really solve those in the traditional sense.
Usually not. Gottman's research suggests the goal with gridlocked problems isn't necessarily to find a compromise solution immediately, but to achieve deep understanding and dialogue around the issue. The key is to uncover the underlying dreams or values fueling each person's position.
Dreams, what does that mean?
It means understanding what that rigid stance symbolizes for your partner. Why is being extremely frugal so important to them? Maybe it represents a dream of security, a deep fear of repeating childhood poverty. Why is having a perfectly clean house vital? Maybe it symbolizes a dream of order and control in a chaotic world.
So you try to understand the meaning behind the behavior.
Yes. Once you understand and can respect the underlying dream, even if you don't agree with the specific behavior, you can often find ways to honor that dream in the relationship, which takes the toxic sting out of the conflict. The goal becomes dialogue and mutual respect, not necessarily agreement.
That process of understanding deep needs requires a lot of compassion, both for the partner and for oneself. Which brings us to Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion and the idea that it isn't always soft and gentle.
Exactly. Neff makes this wonderful distinction between tender self-compassion and fierce self-compassion.
Tender is what we usually think of, right? Being kind and accepting of ourselves when we suffer or fail.
Yes, that's the nurturing, comforting aspect, accepting our imperfections. Fierce self-compassion is the other side of the coin. It's protective, motivating, action-oriented. It's the energy we use to stand up for ourselves, to meet our needs, to protect ourselves from harm. Neff sometimes calls it the mama bear energy directed inward.
How does that fierce compassion show up in practice?
A key way is through setting boundaries. Fierce self-compassion gives us the strength and clarity to say no when needed to protect ourselves from burnout, exploitation, or self-sabotage.
So it's not just accepting that you're overwhelmed.
No, tender compassion might be acknowledging, wow, I'm really stressed and exhausted. Fierce compassion is then taking action based on that acknowledgement, like drawing a clear boundary with work demands that are unreasonable or ending a relationship that is consistently harmful. It requires courage and empowerment to act protectively towards oneself.
That's a really powerful balance, the acceptance and the action. Okay, let's zoom out now for the final section of Part 3, looking at the widest context. The influence of systems, environments, and control. This often feels like it clashes with our sense of individual agency.
It definitely can. And this brings thinkers like B.F. Skinner into the picture, who had a very behavioral perspective. Skinner argued that our whole notion of a struggle for freedom isn't really about some internal willpower battling external forces.
What is it about then, according to him?
He saw it as observable behavior, the actions we take to escape or avoid aversive meaning, unpleasant or punishing features of our environment. And often, he noted, these aversive features are deliberately set up by other people or institutions to control behavior.
Skinner was quite critical of how we usually talk about freedom, wasn't he? Defining it just as an internal feeling.
Yes, he found that problematic. Because if you define freedom only as a feeling of autonomy, you can be easily controlled by systems that don't feel immediately oppressive, but still manipulate your behavior through subtle rewards or contingencies.
Like social media algorithms designed to keep you scrolling, you might feel like you're freely choosing to watch another video.
But the system is built on contingencies. The relationship between your action, scrolling, and the consequence, intermittent dopamine hits from new content, designed specifically to maximize your engagement, often against your longer-term interests.
Yeah.
Skinner argued that real freedom requires analyzing and changing those external contingencies of control, not just focusing on how free you feel.
Can you give another example of a contingency we might overlook?
Sure, think about health habits. If your kitchen is full of easily accessible junk food, making unhealthy eating a very convenient contingency, and the nearest gym requires a 20-minute drive, making exercise an inconvenient contingency, your environment is powerfully shaping your behavior towards being less healthy, regardless of how much you internally want to eat well and exercise. Changing the contingencies, like stocking the fridge with pre-cut veggies and putting walking shoes by the door, changes the behavior.
And this power of the environment, the system can have really profound, sometimes devastating effects on groups, as Philip Zimbardo demonstrated.
Zimbardo's work, particularly the Stanford Prison Experiment, really hammered home the Lucifer effect, the idea that the situation, the system, can exert enormous pressure on individuals. His conclusion was stark. Often it's not about bad apples. It's that bad systems create bad situations, which in turn can cause even good people to behave in bad ways. The context can overwhelm individual disposition.
And one psychological outcome of being trapped in a system where your actions seem to have no effect is learned helplessness.
Exactly. Learned helplessness, first identified by Seligman in animal studies but applicable to humans, is that state of passive resignation that sets in when an individual repeatedly experiences uncontrollable, often arbitrary negative events.
Like working for a boss whose feedback is completely random and unrelated to performance.
Precisely. If the environment consistently teaches you that your efforts make no difference to the outcome, whether you get rewarded or punished, seems arbitrary, you eventually learn to stop trying. You become passive. This isn't an inherent character flaw. It's a learned response to a dysfunctional system.
And finally, to bring this full circle back to where we started with Festinger and dissonance. Our social groups play a huge role in navigating these external pressures and maintaining our internal consistency, don't they?
Absolutely. When the external world, or objective facts, challenge our beliefs or the way our system operates, we naturally seek out others who share our views. Social groups become a vital resource for reducing cognitive dissonance.
We get confirmation, validation.
Yes. Hearing others echo our beliefs reinforces them, makes the dissonance feel less threatening. This social reinforcement strongly guides what we talk about, who we talk to. It helps maintain the group's shared reality, even if that reality involves ignoring inconvenient truths or problematic systemic issues. It's like confirmation bias operating at the group level.
Okay, that really brings our synthesis together. We've journeyed through these three huge interconnected areas. Our deep internal need for cognitive consistency and a coherent narrative.
The practical, strategic necessity of building small, consistent actions, focusing on trajectory over results.
And finally, the undeniable pervasive influence of our relationships, our attachment styles, and the broader environmental and systemic contingencies that shape our behavior, often without our full awareness.
And hopefully for you listening, starting to grasp these underlying mechanics, how your mind defends its story, how structure beats willpower for action, how relationships and systems pull the strings, that awareness is really the first essential step toward making any kind of intentional, positive change.
But we want to leave you with one final, maybe slightly unsettling thought. It really highlights this gap between the inner world we feel we inhabit and control and the external forces acting upon us. We heard from Sachs how vital that continuous inner narrative is for our very identity. We need that story to feel like a coherent self.
Yeah, we desperately construct and maintain it. Yet we also heard from Skinner and Zimbardo how powerful those external contingencies and systems are, how they shape behavior through mechanisms that are often complex, subtle, and not immediately obvious through casual observation.
So here's the provocative question. How much of our cherished inner world, our sense of self, our beliefs, our feeling of making free choices is actually just a sophisticated echo, a reaction to environmental cues, social pressures, and behavioral contingencies that we haven't fully recognized or analyzed?
It's the idea that we might feel free primarily because we don't perceive the constraints, or because the system is designed with rewards that make compliance feel like choice. Recognizing those potentially hidden contingencies, that's the really profound challenge.
The knowledge and the tools to analyze these forces exist. We've touched on many of them today. But applying them rigorously to ourselves, to dissect the narratives that systems and our own minds have built, often unconsciously, that takes a certain kind of courage.
C.G. Jung called it something like the ascetic discipline of mind, known to us as the critique of knowledge. It's not just about what you know, but critically examining how you know it, questioning the foundations of your own beliefs and assumptions.
And having the courage maybe to dismantle some of the comfortable fictions we live by once we see how they've been constructed by forces outside our immediate awareness, that's the deep work.